hope you can see me and hear me. I hope we're live. I'm just going to check whether we are. Yes, I think we are most definitely live. Okay. Alright. Hello, I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. A couple of quick things that I want to tell you before we get into today's lesson. We generally meet from 3 to 4 p.m. every day except Sunday. Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays are for grade 12. Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays are for grade 11. Another thing I should let you know is that I teach in English. I don't know Hindi. So if that's not something that you're very interested in, if English is something maybe that you struggle with, then please let me know in the chat and feel free to ask me questions about what I'm saying so that I can clarify things for you if you want me to do that. Yes, those are the two things that I wanted to tell you. With that said, I actually want to add one more thing, which is that I will be checking the chat in between. I won't be checking it too regularly because I've realized that when I do that, it kind of takes up too much time from class. So instead, I'll be pausing at moments to check the chat, but you can leave your questions there. And if there are questions about the lesson, then I'll address them as we're doing the lesson. But if there are other questions, then I'll just take them at the very end if we have some time then. So I hope that makes sense. I hope all of that is clear. All of that said, let us get into today's lesson. Today we're going to be doing Lost Spring, Stories of Stolen Childhood. It should say childhood. The word has kind of slipped into non-existence on the screen. But yeah, it's Stories of Stolen Childhood by Anise Jung. Now, first things first, who is Anise Jung? She is a journalist, a columnist, and an author. She is very interested in bringing attention to the stories of other people. She writes about those kinds of things a lot. And she is especially interested in drawing the attention of the readers to people who have maybe not been written about, or people who tend to disappear from mainstream writing and mainstream news and mainstream ideas. So what we're going to be reading today is actually an extract from a longer book that she's done called Lost Spring, Stories of Stolen Childhood. And this book is a collection of stories like the stories that we're going to encounter in today's lesson. They're about, as I said already, she likes to write about specific sets of people about whom there isn't a lot of conversation. So here too, there is a specific set of people that we will be discussing, and as we read the story, we'll kind of figure out who this specific set of people are. This is an interesting story partly because it's not really something you can call a story, right? It's a set of accounts about other people's lives that Anise Jung has sort of pieced together into a book. So while we'll be encountering a lot of characters in this, and we'll be getting a little bit of a glimpse into each of their lives, it's true also that these are very real life stories. These are things that have actually happened. And another thing that's also true is that the way we'll be encountering these characters is through Anise Jung, by which I mean that She is going to be our narrator. She is going to have a very strong presence in the text. She is going to kind of take us from one person to another person to another person. So there are also stories of the people that she's met and the people that she's interviewed for these collections of stories. In some sense, it's like a chronicle. It's by which I mean it's a collection of stories, but also she's chronicling somebody else's life. And it reads a little bit like you would expect maybe a newspaper to read. More interesting language, but the way that we are given all of the information about these people, it comes across as giving us the kind of information that a newspaper article, for instance, would give us. So that's something that you'll also see as we start reading the story. As usual, what we're going to do while we're reading this story is we're going to read the paragraphs together. We're going to try to understand their meaning. And as we understand their meaning, we're going to stop at certain points and discuss the themes of those paragraphs. I hope all of that's clear. If you have any questions so far, I'm looking at the chat right now. Thank you. Okay. I really need some water, so give me a second. Alright. No more questions. No questions actually at all. So let's get into the lesson itself. So we have two extracts from the larger book that we're getting in this specific lesson. And the first extract is titled for us, "Sometimes I Find a Rupee in the Garbage." Interesting title. Immediately we know that there is some character in this extract who finds a rupee in the garbage, which is surprising because generally garbage is associated with things that are useless, right? Things that you've thrown out that you don't need anymore. And there, this person is finding money, which is something valuable, which is something that people want to keep, not throw out. So the rupee has presumably been thrown out either by accident or by someone who maybe doesn't care very much about throwing out a rupee because it doesn't hold a lot of value to them. And yet in the story we'll find that finding a rupee holds a lot of value to the person who finds it. "Why do you do this?" I ask Sahib, whom I encounter every morning, scrounging for gold in the garbage dumps of my neighborhood. So our narrator is Anees John, and she is talking to somebody called Sahib, and she is asking Sahib why he does this. And what is this? Every morning Sahib goes looking for gold. Scrounging means searching, like with a lot of attention and focus, for gold in all of the garbage dumps in their neighborhood. Gold in garbage dumps. Interesting phrase, and we'll talk about it a bit more in some time. Sahib left his home long ago. So this neighborhood that Anees calls my neighborhood is actually just her neighborhood. It isn't where Sahib lives, and his home is actually a place that he's left long ago. Set amidst the green fields of Dhaka, his home is not even a distant memory. So his home is actually in an entirely different country. Dhaka is in Bangladesh, and that's where his home is. And his home is not even a distant memory, which means he can't even remember it. That's how long ago he's left his home. So you know how when you've left a place, you can say, oh, I distantly remember it. I remember it a little bit, like it happened very far away, like it was from very far ago. Even that little shred of memory isn't something that he has about his home, because that's how long he has not been home. There were many storms that swept away their fields and homes, his mother tells him. So Sahib's mother tells him that the reason they've left their home is because there were natural disasters that destroyed their homes and destroyed their fields, which tells us that these people are farmers, that they depend on agriculture for their livelihood. They used to depend on it when they lived in Dhaka, but then the natural disasters destroyed their livelihood, and it destroyed their places, their settlements. That's why they left. And because of the natural disaster, all these people have left their home, looking for gold in the big city where he now lives. And now they've moved to a big city. We'll find out which big city a little while into the story. And now all of them look for gold. Again, gold is an interesting phrase, an interesting word, and we'll come to it in a bit. And so every day they spend their days now looking for gold instead of practicing their old livelihood, which was agriculture. I have nothing else to do, he mutters, looking away. So the narrator asks Sahib why he does this, and Sahib says, I don't have anything else to do. And he mutters, which means that he's using a very low volume. It also suggests that he's a little bit embarrassed, especially because he looks away. So it's a question he doesn't really want to answer, because it's a question that whose answer he doesn't really like. Go to school, I say glibly. Glibly means sort of thoughtlessly. You just casually say something that's a little bit silly, and you say it like, oh, okay, in this tone that hasn't really thought through what it's saying. Realizing immediately how hollow the advice must sound. So our narrator says it, and then she realizes, oh no, the advice that I've just given is really hollow, which means it's very empty. There's no real meaning to what I've said. This is an interesting interaction, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail while we talk a little bit about themes. This is a definition of glibly, which I just gave you. Take a screenshot if you want. Okay, now, is he looking for actual gold? Are his parents who are there with him and looking for gold in the city also looking for actual gold? No. Nobody is actually looking for like the metal gold. What gold stands in for here is something valuable, right? Something meaningful, something precious, something that will earn them some kind of money. So that's what gold here means, and that's what these people are looking for in the garbage. They're looking for something valuable that maybe they can sell. They're looking for actual money, which does get thrown away sometimes. They're looking for anything that can be of any sort of productive use to them and of benefit to their lives. So that's what gold here stands in for. Another thing that we immediately get from that paragraph that we just read is that Sahib and his family are migrants. They've come into this country from another country, because this is set in India. So they've come from Bangladesh to India, and they're refugees from a natural disaster. So presumably they left because of force. They left specifically here because of a disaster in their country that made sure that they couldn't live where they used to anymore, and so they were forced to move to India. So these are a couple of things that we get immediately. Okay, one more thing I actually want to talk about here is this interaction between Sahib and the narrator, right? We have the narrator who asks this question, which is a little bit ignorant, you know, it's a little bit thoughtless. Why would somebody do something like this unless they had a need to do something like this? It's a realization that comes upon us as we grow sort of older maybe, or as we start paying more attention to our surroundings. There are a lot of people live their lives in very different kinds of ways. But this seems to be something that the narrator doesn't entirely know yet, because she very casually asks this question, and then she very casually says, go to school. And then she realizes that it's a bit hollow as advice, but we'll talk about why after we read the next paragraph. There is no school in my neighborhood. When they build one, I will go. Sahib tells her that he can't go to school because there is no school where he lives, and that when people build a school there, he'll go to school. If I start a school, will you come? I ask, half joking. And the narrator says, oh, if I start school, will you come to the school? And she's teasing him, like we tease each other in everyday conversations. But he says, yes, he says, smiling broadly. But what she says actually seems to give him some sort of joy, and he responds very positively to it. He says yes, And he seems to respond to this question of hers, which is sort of joking, very seriously. A few days later, I see him running up to me. Is your school ready? So he's taken her so seriously that a couple of days later, when he sees her, he runs up to her and he asks if her school is ready. It takes longer to build a school, I say. And the narrator says, oh, it's just been a few days, it takes a lot more time to build a school. But actually, the narrator is embarrassed at having made a promise that was not meant. But when the narrator says, oh, it takes longer than this to build a school, she's just trying to deflect and avoid from the fact that she made a promise that she'd start a school, and when she made that promise, when she said that to Sahib, she wasn't being serious at all. And so she feels a little guilty and a little bad about having said something she didn't mean that somebody else took seriously. So because of that, she just, puts off that conversation by saying, oh, it takes longer to build a school. It's this sort of excuse that you give someone when you've said something you don't mean, and you have to find some way of covering up the fact that you didn't mean it. But promises like mine abound in every corner of his bleak world. Bleak means dull. It means a little bit, it means empty. It means there's really nothing bright or happy around you. So the narrator describes Sahib's world as being bleak, and she says that promises like hers are manifold in his world, which means that a lot of people make false promises to Sahib, to not specifically just Sahib, but people in Sahib's life and in Sahib's world. And again, we'll read a little bit more about where specifically Sahib is and things like that a little bit further into the story. So here we get in this paragraph a reason, right? We get a reason for why the first initial conversation that the narrator and Sahib have had is filled with this kind of lack of awareness from the side of the narrator. The narrator says go to school, and her advice is hollow because there isn't a school that Sahib can go to. And the narrator too does realize that they both live very different kinds of lives, but not entirely, not enough to know, for instance, that Sahib would take her words about building a school for him very seriously. So one thing that we immediately get here is that Sahib's access to resources is very, very limited. For one, he is looking for valuable things in garbage, which means that this is their livelihood, which suggests socioeconomically that they struggle a lot, they don't have a lot of money. And two, he says there isn't a school in his neighborhood, which means that wherever they live, there isn't access to an actual school. And this also tells us that an access to resources can often prevent people from accessing all of these facilities that a lot of us take for granted. For instance, we're kind of in a virtual classroom right now, right? What's happening right here is education. But think about someone who maybe doesn't have access to internet, and because they don't have access to the internet, which is an infrastructure, because they don't have access to this particular facility, they also can't access education. And so a lot of people kind of can't access many things that could perhaps be important to them, that often are very important, for instance, to the rest of us who are getting to sit here together right now. So that's one thing we get. And another thing we get, this false promises statement. Who do you think these false promises are from, right? The narrator doesn't really tell us, but from what you and I know about the world, we can guess that these false promises probably come first from the government, from the state, from people, politicians especially, who may promise to make all of these people's lives better and just don't. All of the empty promises that politics does bring and that governments do make. So those kinds of false promises from the state. And false promises also probably from families who sometimes want to make their kids feel better and offer empty words to their kids. And eventually the kids find out that, you know, whatever their family said was going to happen at some point, like, oh, maybe like 2 years from now you can go to school, is not really true and is something that's not really going to happen. So false promises just come from every sort of corner of Sahib's life, for instance. Okay, I'm gonna start the next paragraph, but before we do that, I'm just gonna take a look at the chat. Hello to Rahul. Okay. Yes. Another thing we can talk about with regard to these particular paragraphs is the narrator's tone, right? We already discussed this when we were talking about the first paragraph, but here it continues a bit. This kind of, there's a lack of awareness in her, certainly, but it's not that she means to be cruel, you know. It's just that she doesn't think to see things differently. It's more that she doesn't know, and that's all. It's not something that we can sort of blame her for, or something that we should hold her responsible for necessarily. It sounds actually, in fact, here like she is also a little bit young, like she is also just casually holding a conversation, and she doesn't realize that her words will have weight to them. That, for instance, when she says this, if I start a school, will you come? And she's being joking. She doesn't realize that it could be taken seriously. It's not like she knows it and then does it deliberately to be cruel. She just kind of does it by accident. So we see that kind of tone from the narrator here. After months of knowing him, I ask him his name. Sahib-e-Alam, he announces. He does not know what it means. So the narrator only asks for Sahib's name after months of sort of seeing him around and knowing him. And then he tells her his name. And he doesn't know the meaning of his name, but she does. So she tells us, if he knew its meaning, Lord of the Universe, he would have a hard time believing it. So the meaning of Sahib-e-Alam is Lord of the Universe, and the narrator tells us that if Sahib knew what his name meant, then Sahib wouldn't believe what it meant. And what does this mean? It doesn't mean that he would say, no, Sahib-e-Alam does not mean that. He would find it difficult to believe because he is not the Lord of the Universe, right? He is actually quite far from the Lord of the Universe. He is someone who is living a life that is full of all these kinds of struggles, where, for instance, he can't even go to school. And so he would have a hard time believing that his name could mean something like this when his life is so far from the meaning of his name. Unaware of what his name represents, he roams the streets with his friends, an army of barefoot boys who appear like the morning birds and disappear at noon. So Sahib doesn't know what his name means. He doesn't feel any of the possibly complex feelings that would come at knowing what his name means. Maybe some bitterness, maybe some resentment, maybe some frustration. That's the kind of meaning that the narrator wants to bring across to us when she says unaware of what his name means. He roams the streets with his friends. So without knowing all of this, without carrying all of this specific weight, he's a little carefree in the way that he acts. Every day he's sort of going around the streets with his friends. And who are his friends? An army of barefoot boys. This isn't an actual army, it's a collective noun for a bunch of boys. And barefoot is how they're described, so we know they're not wearing slippers or anything of the sort. So these boys, without wearing slippers, are roaming around the streets. They appear in the morning and they disappear at noon, which means they presumably go back home. So this isn't where they live. They just come here, they look around for things, and then they go back. Over the months, I have come to recognize each of them. So the narrator has been watching these people for months and months, and over all this time of watching them, she's come to know who each of them are. Why aren't you wearing chappals? I asked one. And she asks one of them, why aren't you wearing slippers? Because what the narrator is used to, what you and I are used to, is wearing slippers when we walk on the roads and when we roam on the streets. And these boys aren't wearing slippers. So she's curious and she asks why. My mother did not bring them down from the shelf, he answers simply. And he says, oh, you know, my mother didn't get the chappals down, they're on the shelf. And we don't know if this is true or if this is just something the mother has told him, right? And we'll, as we go on to the rest of this paragraph, we'll talk about that again. Even if she did, he'll throw them off, adds another, who is wearing shoes that do not match. Another boy says, oh, even if his mother brought the shoes down and gave it to him, he'll put them off and leave them somewhere. And this boy is wearing shoes that don't match, so each foot has a different shoe on it. When I comment on it, he shuffles his feet and says nothing. And the narrator says something about it. She says, oh, you're wearing shoes that don't match. And the boy just kind of awkwardly stands in place and moves in place and doesn't say anything. He stays silent. I want shoes, says the third boy, who has never owned a pair all his life. And then we have another child who says, oh, I want to wear shoes. And this boy has basically never seen shoes. I mean, he's seen shoes. Obviously, his friend is wearing them. But he hasn't walked in a pair of shoes probably. He hasn't had a pair of shoes to call his own. Traveling across the country, I have seen children walking barefoot in cities, on village roads. The narrator tells us that when she's gone all over the country, she's seen little children and all of them have been walking without slippers, and they've been walking, and she's seen them everywhere barefoot, right? She's seen them in cities, in villages, barefoot, all across the country. It is not lack of money, but a tradition to stay barefoot is one explanation. So one explanation that the narrator has heard for why all of these children don't wear shoes is that it's a practice, right? It's something that everyone's just used to. It's a tradition. So everyone stays barefoot. It's not because there isn't enough money to buy a pair of shoes. The narrator isn't so sure about this explanation, as she tells us, I wonder if this is only an excuse to explain away a perpetual state of poverty. Perpetual means sort of permanent. It carries on and on and on and on. So the narrator is wondering if this entire idea that people, don't wear shoes because they just have a tradition to stay barefoot, if it's just a lie that people have made up so that they don't have to think about the fact that they are being forced into this situation where they can't wear shoes by the state of poverty that they're in. Let's talk about this paragraph a little bit in detail. What we get by the time we reach this last line, right, is that it's possible that many of the things that these people tell us are just excuses to explain away the fact that they are too poor to own shoes and to buy shoes. And so when we read, for instance, this line by this boy who says, my mother did not bring them down from the shelf, we think to ask, why did she not bring them down from the shelf? And now we know that it's possible, A, that they don't have slippers at all, and this is possibly just something his mother is telling him to make him feel better, or to make herself feel better, that, she can say this to him instead of saying, oh, we don't have slippers that I can give you. Or B, it's possible that slippers are so valuable to them that it doesn't seem worth it for slippers to be worn when he is going around the roads, right? So very rare occasion things because they're that precious. And we read this line also in a very different light. The second boy says, oh, he'll throw them off even if she gives him shoes. Why is that? Maybe because he's just very used to not wearing slippers. And so if he puts them on, he might just forget and throw them off. And this boy is wearing shoes that don't match, and you can see when he shuffles his feet and he doesn't say anything that he is embarrassed by the fact that the narrator points out that he is wearing shoes that aren't of the same kind, because that's not how people generally wear shoes. And it suggests again that these shoes are not shoes that have been bought, possibly. Maybe they're shoes that have been found, maybe they're shoes that have been donated, maybe they're shoes that have been bought second hand or third hand or something of that sort. And so it's not like he went to a store and said, oh, let me like buy the best pair of shoes that are here and wear those. That's not what's going on here. And so there's some sort of embarrassment to the fact that he can't live how people are supposed to live, which is wearing shoes that do match. And the third boy is very like straightforward about it and says, oh, I want shoes, and he doesn't have them. And the narrator explains this entire scene to us in this last like section. She says that, you know, people come up with all sorts of excuses to explain away the ways in which they live. And you know, it's interesting because it's not that these people are only lying to other people, right? It's not like if the narrator goes up to someone and says, oh, you know, why are all these people not wearing slippers? And the people are like, oh, we don't wear slippers because it's our tradition to stay barefoot. In this case, they'd be lying to the narrator, who is somebody else. So lying to an outsider about why they live in this way, and not saying that they are actually very poor and that's why they live in this way, is a situation in which these people are safeguarding their pride, right? It's not an easy thing to admit that one can't afford slippers. It's not an acceptable thing also in our society to talk very openly about poverty and not being able to afford things. So the fact that these people would want to hide it from other people, it makes some sense, right? But it also sounds like it's something that they want to hide from themselves, you know, like an explanation that they give to themselves. When they say, for instance, oh, it's a tradition to stay barefoot, it's possible that they're saying it so that they can convince themselves that the way that they live is fine, and it isn't a consequence of situation that they've been put in because of their economic state, of the circumstances that they've been forced into. That gives us some sort of reassurance, some sense of reassurance that we can give ourselves. For instance, if I've taken a very difficult subject, this is a really bad analogy, but I'm giving it to you anyway. If I've taken a really difficult subject and I'm really struggling with it, and you know, I've had to take the subject because it's required by the school boards for me to take that subject. Let's say it's math, because I'm really bad at math. I have to do math, and I find it impossibly hard, and I'm really bad at it. But at some points I may tell myself something like, oh, you know, I actually want to take math, like I want to challenge myself, and I'm trying here to just make myself feel better. It's not something I very seriously mean. I probably didn't want to take math, but I had to take math, and so I'm trying to make myself feel better about it, because there's no other way to escape from this circumstance and from this situation, right? And that's something similar to what's going on in this situation. I've said a lot of things with regard to this paragraph, so I'm gonna check the chat again. Let me know if that is clear, or if you have any questions about what I said, or if I terribly confused you with my math analogy. Hello to Samya and Rahul and Anurag. I am okay. It is a very rainy sort of Wednesday, so no sunshine, missing the sun. How are you? Okay. I see no questions, which I hope means that all of this is clear. And so let's carry on into the next segment. I remember a story a man from Udupi once told me. Udupi is in Karnataka. So the narrator is telling us that she's now thinking about a story that someone from Udupi told her once upon a time. As a young boy, he would go to school past an old temple where his father was a priest. And so this man has actually told her a story from his childhood, from back when he was a little boy and he used to go to school. And when he used to go to school, he used to go by a temple, and his father was the priest of that temple. He would stop briefly at the temple and pray for a pair of shoes. So every time he crossed by the temple, he'd stop and he'd pray for a pair of shoes. So he didn't have a pair of shoes, much like all these other boys who don't have pairs of shoes. And that's why the narrator has remembered this story. The lack of shoes is the common link that's made her think about this story. 30 years later, I visited his town and the temple, which was now drowned in an air of desolation. Desolation means isolation and ruin. The sort of, over time, the kind of slow wearing down of the temple, and now not many people go to that temple anymore. So that's the air that's around the temple, that's the atmosphere of that temple. And she is visiting this place 30 years after this man tells her the story. In the backyard, where lived the new priest. It's been so much time that there is an entirely new priest there now, and in the backyard is where the new priest lives, the backyard of the temple. There were red and white plastic chairs. So in the backyard of the temple, there are red and white plastic chairs. A young boy dressed in a grey uniform, wearing socks and shoes, arrived panting and threw his school bag on a folding bed. So while she is there, she sees this little boy, and he is dressed in a uniform, which means he is going to school. He's wearing socks and shoes. He has shoes. He arrives to the backyard, presumably the son of the new priest, and he's come running, clearly, because he's arriving panting. He's out of breath, and he throws his bag onto the bed, kind of like how we come home from school and just put our bags somewhere, very tired from the day. Looking at the boy, I remembered the prayer another boy had made to the goddess when he had finally got a pair of shoes. Let me never lose them. So when she looks at this little boy, she thinks about the man who told her this story, and how he'd made a prayer to the goddess after he got a pair of shoes, right? So for a long time, he spent time praying for a pair of shoes, and then when he finally got the pair of shoes, his prayer was, I hope I can always have this pair of shoes. I hope I never lose this pair of shoes. The goddess had granted his prayer. And she says, the goddess made his prayer come true. What does that mean? We'll talk about it. Young boys like the son of the priest now wore shoes. So little boys are now wearing shoes, but many others, like the rag pickers in my neighborhood, remain shoeless. Though some of these people wear shoes, there are still a lot of people, such as the rag pickers in our neighborhood, all those little boys who are looking for gold in the garbage. All of them still don't have shoes. They still can't wear shoes. What does all of this mean? This is such an odd little interlude from, we were right there with Sahib and the boys and the narrator on her streets, and now we've gone all the way into Karnataka. And why have we gone into this little story that's actually seems like a distraction from the main story? We'll talk about it. Just give me a second while I get some water. Good evening to Ashutosh and Shivangi. Okay. So first thing, Udupi is in Karnataka, as I said. Second thing, the narrator notes for us that in the backyard there are red and white plastic chairs. What does this mean? It shows us that there's been a shift in time, right? And now there are plastic chairs outside a temple, which was something that wouldn't have happened maybe long ago, even 30 years ago. So this is a new addition to the temple, which shows us this is a little bit more in modern times, whereas the other one was a little bit more, this segment 30 years ago was more in the older times when chairs were not very common. And a school child wearing shoes is okay. So we're going to first talk about actually what this means, and then we're going to talk about the school child wearing shoes image and what that means. So what's happening here is that there's a contrast that's being made from back then and now, right? In the same setting, about the same sets of people. So priests and their sons are the sets of people that we're looking at, and we're looking at them 30 years ago when someone prayed very hard for a pair of shoes, and we're looking at them 30 years into the future when someone does have a pair of shoes. And that contrast tells us that this dream of that little boy at the very beginning of the story, who hopes for a pair of shoes, who prays for a pair of shoes, and then he prays, I hope I never lose them, has been granted, the narrator tells us, through all of these boys in the future, like this one who is wearing the grey uniform with socks and shoes. So the narrator is kind of extending that boy's prayer. When the boy prays and says, oh, let me never lose these shoes, he is thinking about himself, right? He doesn't want to give up the shoes that he's gotten. But the narrator is expanding it to think about many little boys like him, and she's saying the prayer was granted for all of those people. Shoes are now something that is very common to all of the people here, and it's something that they all wear. Now it's unclear to us why it was that the little boy in the past couldn't wear shoes. Maybe it was economic issues, in which case what this particular segment where all these little boys can now wear shoes means is that now their economic status, the economic status of priests, is better. Or it could just mean that back then shoes were unusual, something that a lot of people didn't wear, and now shoes are a very commonplace thing, and young boys, like the son of the priest, are wearing shoes. So that's what this little segment means, and I hope that's somewhat clear. And the idea, the image of a school child who's wearing shoes is a very common image, right? It's one that we're very used to seeing. It's something that is our normal, and it's a lifestyle that we're very familiar with. But here, there are entire groups of people who are praying for these shoes, and there are groups of people who consider it important enough to ask for it as a prayer, and also groups of people who just still don't have access to that kind of lifestyle. So these shoes become not just a concern of shoes, right? It's not like what the narrator is trying to say here is, oh, these people should get shoes. She's trying to say this lack of shoes is representative of a lack of a lot of other things that all of us who live maybe better economic lifestyles are so used to and are so comfortable with. So the shoes sort of stand in for all of those other broader things also, including, for instance, education, because here this little boy is a schoolboy who's going to school wearing shoes, but we know that Sahib can't go to school because there isn't a school in his neighborhood. Checking the chat again for Shivangi asks me when classes. Shivangi, classes from 3 to 4 every day. Okay. My acquaintance with the barefoot rag pickers leads me to Seemapuri. Okay, we're finally being told where it is that Sahib and his family lives, what Sahib's world is. They live in Seemapuri, a place on the periphery of Delhi, yet miles away from it metaphorically. And the narrator tells us that Seemapuri is on the outskirts of Delhi. It's near the edges of Delhi, but it's actually very, very, very far away from it, metaphorically. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Those who live here are squatters who came from Bangladesh back in 1971. The people who live in Seemapuri are squatters, which means that they're illegal occupants. They don't have permission to be on this land. They're staying here without permission. Permission from who? Permission from the government, permission from the state. And all of these are people who came from Bangladesh in 1971. We know from Sahib and through his mother that there was a natural disaster back in Dhaka, and at that point people migrated from Bangladesh to India. So that happened in 1971, and all of these people have been living here from then. Sahib's family is among them, and Sahib also lives here. Simapuri was then a wilderness. So in 1971, Simapuri was a place that wasn't populated. It was a wilderness in the sense that, it's the kind of place that you see on the outskirts of a city, where there are lots of trees, lots of empty fields, empty spaces, lots of bush growth, not really many houses, not really many facilities, not really a place that a lot of people live. It still is. So Simapuri is still a wilderness in the sense that all of the things that we're used to having in a city, like electricity or like proper roads, for instance, all of those things are still not there. It's still a wilderness, but it is no longer empty. But now there are these people who are living in the wilderness. In structures of mud, with roofs of tin and tarpaulin, devoid of sewage, drainage or running water, live 10,000 rag pickers. There are 10,000 rag pickers who live in Simapuri, and where do they live? They've made houses out of mud for themselves with tin, with roofs of tin, with tin is a metal, and tarpaulin is it's a kind of cloth. So these are the roofs that they use, the materials that they use to make their houses. They don't have access to sewage or drainage, so things that we take for granted again, like toilets that we're used to, washrooms that we're used to, they don't have access to any of those things. They don't have access to running water. So where do they get their water from? We don't quite know, but presumably it's whatever it is, the source isn't, we can't be sure that it's clean or safe or easy to access. Like, again, we are used to getting water every day in our houses, right? They have lived here for more than 30 years without an identity. So now we know also the time period in which this story is written, 30 years from 1970, so the early 2000s. And these people have lived in Simapuri in this sort of situation for all these years without an identity, and we'll talk about what that means too, without permits, which just means that they aren't legally allowed to be there, so they're there illegally, but with ration cards that get their names on voters lists and enable them to buy grain. The only sort of ID card that they have is a ration card, and ration cards help you buy grain for lower prices in stores. So that's the reason that they've gotten themselves ration cards. Food is more important for survival than an identity. So the narrator tells us that food, so this ability to like buy grains at lower prices in ration stores, is more important. So having that ration card is more important than having an identity. And again, what does identity mean here? We'll talk about it immediately. So Simapuri is, we've briefly in Udupi, which is in the south, and now we've gone to Delhi, which is in the north. So we've gone like from one side of the country to the other. So this story really takes us across all the different parts of this country. So we're in Simapuri now, and why does the narrator tell us that it's miles away from Delhi metaphorically, right? Simapuri physically is located outside Delhi, but in terms of what Simapuri is like, the description that we get of Simapuri in this paragraph is very, very different from how Delhi itself looks. Delhi is the capital of our country. It's very, very urban, right? There are a lot of facilities. It's full of all of these things that we consider basic necessities, like electricity, like running water, like drainage, like sewage, but also full of all of these things that are so impressive and that are considered luxuries, like art, for instance, and so many monuments, for instance. So Delhi is an entirely different world from Simapuri in the sense. Please let me know if I am. Looking at the comments. Yes, I was gone for a bit because my laptop messed up. Okay, I think I'm here. I know our class time is technically up, but I'm just gonna run you through a little bit more so we finish like this segment, and then we'll be done with this segment and we can start with the next segment next class. Yeah, so we were in the middle of talking about this paragraph, and we were gonna get to some of the ideas in this paragraph. And one of the things that we should notice specifically in this paragraph is also the fact that all of these homes are really fragile, right? They're very temporary homes. They're made of mud, they're made of tin and tarpaulin. They aren't like houses made of concrete and bricks and things like that. Not houses like the sort that we're used to, very temporary houses. So places that are basically not really made for living in for a really long time. And as we can see, they also don't have the infrastructure to be somewhere that people live in for a really long time. And yet all of these people have lived in this locality for 30 years, which is a really long time. So another couple of things that we should talk about is this specific line. They have lived here without an identity. What does it mean to live without an identity, right? They have ration cards but not an identity. What the narrator is trying to tell us here is through their ration cards. And being, according to the state, these are people who are illegal migrants. They are people who are living in this place without any permission to do so. And because of this, they can't be granted any sort of or legitimacy. They, for instance, won't have like other cards that have their name on them saying this is who they are and they belong to India. That's the kind of identity that they're lacking, right? Verification by the state, validity by the state basically saying yes, you are real, and yes, you are this, and yes, you live here, and yes, because of the fact that you belong to us, we will give you this certain set of facilities that are generally given to people who belong to this state. All of those things are things that they don't have because of the fact that they're migrants, illegal migrants, probably people who are here without any kind of permission. And so when the narrator says that they don't have an identity, she means they don't have legitimacy from the state. They don't have authorization from the eyes of the government. And it sounds very odd to say authorization, like authorization to what? To exist and to exist and lead a good life? Yes, that is actually the kind of authorization that is being talked about here. It seems very odd only when we look at it. It's something that we're actually really so used to that it's something that we don't usually question at all, right? And another thing that we see in this paragraph is that food is more important for survival than an identity. So eating is the basic need that everyone needs to fulfill in order to live to see another day. And that kind of need-based life is what they live right now. Other things aren't important to them. The only thing that really matters is that they make it to the next day. So that's what's going on here. Survival is the center of their lives. If at the end of the day we can feed our families and go to bed without an aching stomach, we would rather live here than the fields that gave us no grain. Say a group of women in tattered saris when I asked them why they left their beautiful land of green fields and rivers. So the narrator is speaking to this group of women in Simapuri, and the women are in tattered saris, torn saris, so the saris are old. Again, and the narrator asks them why they left Bangladesh, which she describes as being very beautiful, which is very full of green fields, which is full of beautiful rivers. And the women say, you know, if here we can feed our families, all of us can eat and we can go to bed without feeling very hungry at the end of the day, then living here is better than living in those beautiful places that gave us nothing to eat. And this is a reference to the disaster, the storm that brought them here, which destroyed all those fields and prevented them from depending on those fields for their lives, for their livelihood. Wherever they find food, they pitch their tents that become transit homes. So these people suggest that they're moving from place to place and they live wherever they can find things to eat. And they live in tents that become It's a place that you live in temporarily, and actual terms, but it could also mean these kinds of mud houses that are put up very quickly and they live in them temporarily. So we also see that these people kind of just keep shifting so that they can live wherever it is feasible for them to live at the moment. Children grow up in them, in these temporary houses, becoming partners in survival. Just like all of these parents are focused on surviving, on feeding everybody in the family, the children also become very focused on survival, which means basically that they grow up thinking first and foremost about survival also. And survival in Simapuri means rag picking. And in Simapuri, the means to survive, the means to get some sort of food, is through going through the garbage and finding things that are there. Through the years, it has acquired the proportions of a fine art. The narrator tells us that all the time that they've been here, they've done this rag picking for so long that almost like an art. And we'll talk about this phrase in a bit. Garbage to them is gold. So the narrator tells us that garbage is gold to these people. This doesn't mean that garbage is actual like gold. It isn't that they look at garbage and think, oh, this is gold, like this is the gold that is metal. It's that garbage is valuable to them because it's their way to survive. It's the same thing that we spoke about in the very first paragraph, right? You're finding value in garbage because it helps you survive. It gives you something to keep living with, and because of that you find it very precious, and that's what highlights for us. It is their daily bread, a roof over their heads, even if it is a leaking roof. So garbage is what gives them their daily bread. Bread is just a substitute for food. It's the roof over their heads, so it's what gives them a house to live in and a roof to shelter them from the outside and from the weather. I told you garbage is precious to them and it gives them all of these necessities. But what these two lines put together also tell us is that what is precious to them is all of these necessities, right? And here, children grow up in these houses, these temporary houses, becoming partners in survival. What an interesting phrase, right? Partners in survival. When you say somebody is your partner, you generally mean they're like you, and you mean that they are working with you and both of you are putting in effort into something, right? So here, the parents are partners with their children and they're both putting in effort into survival. This kind of destroys the idea that we usually have that parents provide for their children and that children grow up dependent on their parents. That idea that children get security from their parents and they grow up like being able to depend on their parents, get everything that they need from their parents is wrecked in this line. Instead, we're told that the children grow up like their parents and from the very beginning they're expected to do all of these things also so that everybody can survive. So there is pressure on the children that isn't usually there on children, and that leads us to the title of this story, which is Lost Spring, Stories of Stolen Childhood. And this is what the narrator means, right? Stolen childhood. It isn't childhood. It isn't, they aren't children in the way that we are used to thinking of children. For instance, as I just said, we're used to thinking that children can depend on their parents and they don't have to do all of this labor. But here in this case, that's not true for these children. They don't get access to that kind of childhood where they can just go around and play and live their lives. They instead are expected to focus on working so they can bring back something home so that everybody in the family can keep going on. And this is what the narrator means when she says stolen childhood. That's what the author means by that title. Their childhood has been stolen. Stolen by whom is a question we'll talk about at the very end of the story. And she also says lost spring. And we'll talk about that part of the title also at the very end of the story. But yeah, this is what I kind of wanted to let you know for now. I sometimes find a rupee, even a 10 rupee note, Sahib says, his eyes lighting up. And now we go back to Sahib, to the very specific story of Sahib. We've gone from this broad approach to Seemapuri and we've gone back to Sahib the person. And Sahib tells the narrator, oh, I found a rupee in the garbage. I've even found like a 10 rupee note in the garbage. And when he says it, his eyes light up, which means they light up with excitement. When you can find a silver coin in a heap of garbage, you don't stop scrounging, for there is hope of finding more. So, if you're going around looking in the garbage and you find a silver coin being a rupee coin in the garbage, then you keep looking at the garbage, wondering if maybe there is more there. It seems that for children, garbage has a meaning different from what it means to their parents. So children find a different kind of value in garbage than their parents do. For the children, it is wrapped in wonder. The children find some kind of wonder in the garbage. For the elders, it is a means of survival. And the parents find only necessity and basic needs in the garbage, right? A livelihood. And we'll talk about this. What does it mean, right? This hope of finding more. It isn't usual to find like a rupee coin in the garbage or a lot of money in the garbage. But still, when you find it, you end up thinking, oh, maybe there could be more. One experience kind of influences you to think that more experiences like that experience are possible. Once that possibility has been opened up, you kind of hope that the possibility will happen again and again and again. And that's what the children find out when they find a coin. And it's such a great occurrence, right? It's something that is very, very valuable to them. And so when they find it, they're like, okay, it's happened once when we thought it couldn't happen at all. And so maybe it'll happen again. So they develop a hope in that sense. And that's kind of where the wonder that the children find in this garbage comes from it, right? They find some sort of possibility in this garbage. They think, okay, it could produce all of these things. While we're looking in it, we could find more than we think we'll find. And that kind of hope is what becomes the wonder here. The possibility of finding all of these things is the wonder that they find in this garbage. Also, in some sense, think about it like maybe you would think about a game and you're looking through something and something magical happens to you. You find some sort of surprise in that, and some sort of, there isn't a synonym I can find for wonder, so I'm just gonna say wonder again. You find some sort of wonder in that, in something that you didn't expect happening to you. So that's the kind of thing that we mean that the narrator means when she makes a distinction between the older people who find only survival in the garbage and these younger people who find wonder in it also. And the fact that Sahib's eyes light up when he talks about finding rupees, that he finds excitement in that, it says that he's still young, that he can still find some things like this exciting, that he can still become a little happier thinking about things like this, which is something that, if you've lived doing this for say 40 years of your life, you're going to be a lot more tired and a lot less likely to react like that. So despite the fact that the author tells us that some of the childhood has been taken from these children, they still are children, right? They're still reacting in ways that children react. That's something that we should note here. Hello to Vashu Kaushik. Please let me know if you have any questions so far. I will be done with this segment and then I will close class. One winter morning, I see Sahib standing by the fenced gate of the neighborhood club, watching two young men dressed in white, playing tennis. So one winter, Sahib is standing outside a gate of the neighborhood club. A neighborhood club is a place in which you generally have to pay to have access to things like this. A place where you play sports, you have access to facilities like a swimming pool and a sports fields. And here Sahib is watching two people who are playing tennis. I like the game, he hums, content to watch it standing behind the fence. Sahib is standing outside, he's watching the game, he says that he likes the game, and he seems completely okay standing outside the fence and watching the game. I go inside when no one is around, he admits. The gatekeeper lets me use the swing. And Sahib admits that when nobody else is around, the gatekeeper lets him in secretly and he can go use the swing. The swing in the club. Couple of themes again. There's a contrast here that we're getting between Sahib and those two men dressed in white clothes. The contrast is of two different socio-economic classes. There is someone who has to stand on the outside of the club, and there are people who are inside the club and who are playing this game, right? Two very different lifestyles. The products of the kind of money that both of these sets of people have, and the differences between their lifestyles is represented here by like an actual gate. There is an actual, like, literal physical gate that is barring Sahib from entering that place, which is a representation really for the way life is, and the way the world is constructed, and all of those things that Sahib can't access because of his money. Where, you know, there might not be like as physical a gate, but for instance school, it just doesn't exist, so he can't go there. So situations like that, that's what this scene shows us and gives us. And it also tells us that Sahib can only go inside, for instance, sneakily, when nobody else is around, which means that he's not allowed inside because he's not paid for it. And this tells us again that there is a barrier that exists between these two classes of people. And yet again, we have this imagery of the swing and Sahib playing on a swing, and we also have Sahib watching a game and enjoying it. And all of that also reminds us that he is still a child, right? And that these are all things that children are used to doing, and these are all things that Sahib has to sometimes, for instance, he has to be okay with just standing behind a fence and watching it, because he knows that it might not be possible for him to actually go and play it. And he has to be okay with going and using the swing only when other people aren't around, and depending on people like the gatekeeper to let him use the swing, even though they are probably not allowed to let him. Sahib too is wearing tennis shoes that look strange over his discolored shirt and shorts. So Sahib is wearing tennis shoes now. He has acquired a pair of shoes somehow, and they look strange because he is wearing an odd like shirt that doesn't really like it isn't properly like colored. Maybe like it got wrecked in the wash, who knows, you know. And he's wearing shorts, and it also looks odd because people generally wear tennis shoes with white clothes, and Sahib doesn't have the tennis clothes to go with those shoes, so it looks out of place. Someone gave them to me, he says in the manner of an explanation. And he tells her, oh, you know, I got these shoes from someone. The fact that they are discarded shoes of some rich boy, who perhaps refused to wear them because of a hole in one of them, does not bother him. So the narrator thinks these shoes are probably like shoes that were worn by some rich kid, and you know, the kid may be like, the narrator is basically imagining a situation in which these shoes were given away and trying to come up with an explanation for why they were given away. And she says, oh, probably like it's some rich kids and there's a hole in the shoe, so the rich kid probably thought, oh, I don't want to wear it because it has a hole in it, and so they've given it away. And the narrator's like, he is not bothered by this idea. Sahib isn't bothered by this idea, bothered by the fact that he is standing outside and watching the game take place inside, right? Why would this bother him? Why does the narrator seem to think that this is an odd thing that it doesn't bother him? She only even mentions it because it's unexpected that it doesn't bother him, right? But there's a reason that it doesn't bother him, and it's because for one who has walked barefoot, even shoes with a hole is a dream come true. So Sahib has been used to being without shoes all this time, so even having a shoe that has holes in it is something that he is okay with. It's something that is quite a good thing for him. And the reason the narrator wonders if it wouldn't be a good thing is because here, for instance, is one boy who is struggling to get hold of a pair of shoes, and there, on the other hand, is another boy who is refusing to wear a pair of shoes, maybe because there's just been a hole in them. So the differences in those lifestyles again, is that disturbing Sahib? No, it's not, because Sahib is only thinking about his lifestyle and his life here, and he he has something better now than he did before, and so he's finding some sort of value in that. And this is what the narrator is trying to tell us. But by giving us the example of the rich boy, the narrator is also trying to tell us that it is something that is odd, that there is a disparity here, and that we should be noticing it. But the game he is watching so intently is out of his reach. Even though he has these tennis shoes which people use to play tennis, playing tennis itself is something that he won't be able to do, because first of all, you need a place where you can play tennis, you need some people to play tennis with, you need all of the equipment that you need to play tennis. So all of these things are very far away things, and they're not things that he can easily access. So all of those are things that probably won't be things that Sahib gets. And yeah, she's contrasting to socio-economic classes there, as we talked about. And this is the very, very, very last paragraph of this segment. This morning, Sahib is on his way to the milk booth. In his hand is a steel canister. I now work in a tea stall down the road, he says, pointing in the distance. I am paid 800 rupees and all my meals. So Sahib is no longer a rag picker. He's found himself a job in a tea stall, and he is, in the morning, he is taking the steel canister, which is a box. It's a container. It's a vessel. He's taking the steel vessel from the tea stall to the milk booth to get milk for the tea stall, and he says that he's getting paid 800 rupees for working in the tea stall, and he's getting all of his meals. They're going to feed him also. Does he like the job? I ask, and the narrator asks if he likes the job. His face, I see, has lost the carefree look. So earlier, Sahib has been someone who's been roaming the streets, who's been free, and that carefreeness is now gone from his face. And that's our implicit answer to whether he likes the job, which is no. The steel canister seems heavier than the plastic bag he would carry so lightly over his shoulder. So here the narrator tells us that the steel vessel that he is carrying seems to be a lot heavier than the plastic bag that he used to carry when he used to pick rags. And in actuality, the steel is also heavier because it's made of steel, right? But that's not what the narrator means here. She means that it seems heavier because of a different reason. It seems to come with more weight, with more emotional weight, with more responsibility. It's weighing him down, and that's why he doesn't look carefree anymore. Because the bag was his, the canister belongs to the man who owns the tea shop. Sahib is no longer his own master. Because the bag was Sahib's, and when Sahib had the bag, he got to decide what he did with his job, which was his own. But now there is a vessel that belongs to somebody else, who is the man who owns the tea shop, and Sahib doesn't run his own life and run his own job, right? He is now going to be ordered around by somebody else, by this man who runs the tea shop. And this brings us to a very important final conclusion for this particular segment, which is that this job basically leaves Sahib in the hands of another person, and this other person will be in control of Sahib with regard to all of the work that he does. And there is an implication here that there is a little bit more freedom in having your life to yourself, right? But also in a suggestion that maybe this job isn't this master, the way that this master is, the personality of the master, the way that they treat Sahib, all of these things are now going to be important to the way that Sahib's life plays out. And it is entirely possible that these aren't like very nice people, and these aren't people who are going to treat him well, right? They might be people who yell, they might be people who just don't care. A lot of these things and a lot of these complications that rise when people go to these kinds of jobs that and end up being under the regulation and control of somebody else. And we'll talk more about that later too. But that was all for today's lesson. It went on for 1.5 hours. Oof, a long time. But thank you for being here. If you're here then please let me know what you like in class, what you don't like in class, what's working for you, what isn't working for you. Leave me feedback in the comments below. Another thing I want to tell you today is that the Unacademy app is free for you to download. You can download it off Google Play Store, and you can put in my code, which is THAR01. And if you use it, then you get a lot of features free, from live quizzes to practice tests to access to a lot more classes like this and a lot more courses. You can also get Unacademy Plus. If you get a subscription with Unacademy Plus, then you get free access to, unlimited access to all the courses that Unacademy has to offer, and access to all of these educators. You'll have access also to doubt clearing sessions, and you'll have very, very thorough coverage of all of the syllabus. So that's Unacademy Plus. And you also have the prices for Unacademy Plus here. You can see that you can get Unacademy Plus for different durations of time, and the per month cost reduces if you're getting it for 24 months, which is a longer duration of time. There is also something called Unacademy Iconic, in which you get access to working with one person, and you get very personal guidance. You get reports about how you're doing. Your parents can contact the educators and find out how you're doing. So that's the benefits of Unacademy Iconic. These are the prices of Unacademy Iconic. Again, prices per month are different based on the durations for which you take up the subscription. And as you can see, for 18 months, for instance, it's 1,944 per month, which is a lot less than 2,833 per month. So that's something you should keep in mind about Unacademy Iconic. Both these subscriptions, you can add a referral code. That's what the THAR01 was. That's my referral code, so you can use that. It'll give you a flat 10% discount. All of that said, thank you for being here with me on Unacademy's platform. If you liked today's session, then please do hit like and subscribe for more content like this. And I will see you again this evening, actually, for a quiz. It's a grade 12 quiz on the last two lessons that we did, which is My Mother at 66 and the last lesson. So be there if you want to have some fun with the quiz.